So I've been asked a couple of times to go ahead and break down the Wigger's diagram for y'all. I'm going to go ahead and do that for you now. What's so special about the Wigger's diagram is it really does summarize really nicely the different parts and events of the heart, what's going on inside the chambers, what's going on with the fluids inside, what's the electric current, how does it all correspond with one another, and if you understand it, you're going to be pretty happy. Not only for A&P3, but also for pathophys, as well as it's going to be a great springboard for when you're in nursing. So first off, this Wigger's diagram does look at the electrical events. It looks at the pressure changes. It looks at your heart sounds. It looks at the volume changes, and it looks at the mechanical events, such as like the valves closing or the heart contracting, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and start off with the electrical events. A lot of you have probably seen this on like the side of a bus or side of a ambulance, maybe. Done kind of poorly, but what do you got to do? You got people from the media trying to copy and paste something like this that everyone should be, or is at least seen in their lives once upon a time. EKG tells you the events of contraction, or what electrical events are happening in the heart. The P wave, you'll notice that it has a P, Q, R, S, T, and all of it's based on milliseconds and millivolts. Remember back when I'm talking millivolts, and I'm going to be using the term depolarization, repolarization. Remember that depolarization, the cells have that electrical balance where it's more positive outside than it is on the inside, so it has a net negative charge. So what happens is this. There's an SA node at the top of your atria, like we talked about earlier. It fires off, and this causes the atria to fire or to contract, and that's what this P wave is. It's the electrical pulse saying, "Hey, atria, contract," and it contracts. We're gonna go ahead and I'm gonna break it down here shortly. QRS is the ventricular depolarization, while the T wave is its repolarization, returning back to its happy place. So here is the P wave. Very first event, SA node triggers off here. It shoots off into the atria saying, "Hey, time to contract." And as soon as it gets past that P wave, the atria actually contracts. Systole means contraction, by the way. That's going to be a word that you're going to want to be familiar with. It should sound somewhat familiar when you're talking about blood pressures. You got a systolic pressure. That's referring to the systolic pressure developed by the ventricles. Anyways, back to the P wave. P wave goes up. It signals for the atria to contract. And it does so. At about the same time, that signal has made it to the AV, the atrioventricular node, and has gone down the septum of the heart, and has now met the apex and is starting to go up these Purkinje fibers in the heart tissue. And you're going to see this QRS wave. The QRS wave gets up there. It starts a ventricular contraction, or the systolic contraction, and it contracts. And then the T wave, which is your repolarization event, begins, and it resets those ventricles, and the ventricles experience ventricle diastole, or aka relaxation. So that is the very first thing that you're going to see on this Wigger's diagram is this EKG. Remember that just the P waves and the PQRS waves refer to the atrial and ventricular depolarization events, with the T wave being the repolarization event of your ventricle. You'll notice also quite nicely that where atria contract is in this pink region. So at the very tippy top of the P wave, you're going to start seeing atrial contraction, atrial systole. And then at the just past the R, you're going to see ventricular systole, or ventricular contraction. Near the end of the T wave, that relaxation, or the resetting of the membrane potential, you're going to see the relaxation of the ventricles themselves. Let's add on one thing now. We're going to look at pressure. Pressure is just the force that something can have against the sides of a wall. When you put in air into a balloon, it increases because of that pressure you're putting into it, or that volume that putting into it. Liquids can almost exert a pressure as soon as they get squeezed very, very quickly, and not like uncompared, like if not comparable to that of air. Water causes an immediate pressure increase. In this case, blood causes an immediate pressure increase whenever their volume decreases, the amount of space that they're in decreases. So we're going to look at the left atria. We're looking up right here, left, and we're looking up right here in the left. That's good fun times right there. And you'll notice as the atria contracts, that pressure inside that atria increases. And it starts to decrease once that liquid that it had in it has been pushed into the ventricles. Once the ventricles begin to contract, some of that liquid is going to start trying to get through. And it's trying, and it's doing a great job until finally that AV valve, that mitral valve, that bicuspid valve, finally catches up, and it parachutes open, and you're not getting any more blood back into the atria. And that pressure goes back down, and you're happy, 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 happy. It's going to slowly increase as that blood starts returning from your veins. And then finally, when the pressure inside the ventricles have decreased enough, that bicuspid valve opens up, and that pressure that was building up in that atria disappears, and then you go through the entire event again. Let's look at the ventricle now. So ventricle, atria contract, and it forces blood in, which causes a little bit of an increase in that pressure in that ventricle. Not a big deal, not a big uh-oh type of thing. When you will actually see that increase is right there. When the ventricles begin to contract, the space that liquid is occupying is getting smaller and smaller, which means that the pressure has to increase more and more and more until finally the aortic valve cracks open, and it starts. You don't really see a compensatory mechanism about that valve until you've gotten to a certain point in which the ventricles have stopped completely contracting, or not quite completely contracting, I should say, more along the lines of it's made its peak pressure, and it's all the compensatory mechanisms are rolling through, and hallelujah, we're not increasing in pressure anymore. And then the ventricles again begin to relax, which drops the pressure sharply because you're increasing the volume that the little liquid that's left inside of it gets to play with, which means that pressure is going to drop dramatically. We're going to look at the aorta as well, the aortic pressure. Aortic pressure is going to start off higher because it's always is higher. As soon as that aortic valve opens up, that pressure that's seen in the aorta shoots up and follows in a similar pattern to that of the ventricle, because it's going to share that same the ventricle is going to share that same pressure to the aorta that it is experiencing. It's not going to drop down like it does in the ventricles, though. It's going to try and stay similar or close to because of this aortic valve. The aortic valve, that pressure starts coming back, or that ventricle starts decreasing, and that blood in the ventricle, that pressure in the ventricle is going to be tempted to come back into the ventricles, but because of that aortic valve, it closes, and you feel like a little repercussion wave, like if you're sloshing around in the bathtub and you push really hard in the bathtub, that water comes rushing back at you. That's sort of what just happened here. The aortic valve is pushed up against that water wave, and that blood is now coming back onto the aorta and giving it that a little bit of extra oomph that you're seeing right here, that dichrotic wave. And then it just plateaus back to its pressure as that blood circulates through the body. Heart sounds, the only thing that you really need to worry about when you're listening to the heart is the valves. That's the heart sounds that you're hearing, is those valves closing. Now, this first one that everyone's hopefully familiar with hearing the lub-dub type of noise. Lub being the first, dub being the second. The lub noise is the first thing that you hear because the ventricles are contracting and the AV valves, the atrioventricular valves, the mitral valve and bicuspid valve, as well as the tricuspid valve on the right, is closing up. And it's closing up quite almost violently. That's where you hear the lub noise, when they close up real tight. The dub noise is when the semilunar valves close. That's the blood rushing back, trying to get back into the ventricles that have been forced out into the body or towards the lungs, but they're not being allowed because those semilunar valves are catching that liquid and making certain they don't come back in. And they're going to the places that they need to go. Let's look at volume. You'll notice that volume and pressure are kind of similar to each other when you look at it. First off, let's look at, we are looking at the volume in the ventricle. We're not looking at anything else. It makes sense that you see an increase in volume here when the atrial contract, the atrial systole, because atria are trying to push more liquid into those ventricles, and they're successful at it, so you see that increase. But as the ventricles contract and that liquid gets shot, you notice that it plateaus here until that SL valve opens, the semilunar valve. As soon as that semilunar valve opens, that liquid is being ejected from the heart, from that ventricle, and into the circulatory system. That's why you see that drop. There is some terminology that you do need to be aware of. It's the end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. Those are both extremely important for calculating stroke volume. Another way to say end diastolic volume is your initial volume. The end systolic volume would be another way of saying final volume. And doing an initial minus a final will give you the stroke volume. Stroke volume, again, V initial minus V final. It then refills back up because as you draw, it draws blood back from the venous return, and you restart all over again with atrial systole. The mechanical events. This is actually describing when you would see and why you would see these closing ups of these valves. So yeah, the atrial contractions, you'll notice that those valves are open and it's forcing that blood into the ventricle. So you'll notice the semilunar valves are still closed as well, though. Something called isovolumetric contraction occurs, in which all that's saying is that it's isovolumetric. Iso just means same. So the pressure inside the atria and the ventricles are the same at one point. And that's when you start seeing those AV valves starting to close back up. Because as soon as the pressure inside those ventricles build up enough, it's going to close those AV valves. And it's going to, as you can see right here, and then it's going to open up because that pressure is actually increasing more and more. It's going to force open those semilunar valves. The isovolumetric relaxation is referring to when blood is in the aorta, in the pulmonary trunk, have become similar to that of the pressure inside the ventricles, and they've sealed up. But it's also talking about the AV valves beginning to open back up because the volume within the atria, or the pressure within the atria and the ventricles, are about the same. And as soon as that is broken, or that pressure is changed, or that volume has changed in favor of the atria, those AV valves are going to open up and squirt that blood back in. And then the whole process begins over and over again. Here it is all together. If you can understand all this, you're going to be just fine in pathophys. You're going to be a great springboard for all your clinicals, especially in cardiology. You'll learn that different things happen in different places. And with that, I hope that was helpful.